Look, animals have been sensing earthquakes for thousands of years. Civilizations have watched it happen, written about it, passed the stories down through generations, and yet we still don't fully understand how they do it. So before we get into the mechanics, before we talk about P waves and electromagnetic fields and the animals that might be listening to all of it, let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed something strange in an animal before a natural disaster hit. Have you seen them act differently? Did it match what you're about to hear? Because the answer matters, and science is still trying to figure it out. So settle in, maybe grab something to drink, and let's explore one of the most haunting mysteries at the intersection of biology and geology. The question is simple, the answer is not. At the very beginning of recorded history, people noticed something peculiar. Animals were leaving before the ground shook. In ancient Greece, around 373 BC, long before seismographs existed, long before anyone had a scientific framework for understanding earthquakes at all, observers documented that rats, weasels, snakes, and centipedes had abandoned their homes and fled to safety days before a devastating earthquake struck the region. This wasn't a single anecdotal account that got distorted over time. This was consistent observation across multiple witnesses and multiple species. These weren't people making things up. These were people watching animals behave in ways that didn't fit normal patterns and then experiencing catastrophic geological events shortly after. The same kind of observations showed up everywhere. In Japan, a culture deeply familiar with seismic activity because they lived with it constantly, folklore developed around Namazu, a giant catfish living deep beneath the islands that supposedly thrashed its tail against the seabed to cause earthquakes. That's the mythological version, but embedded inside that myth is something real. People had watched animals, particularly certain water creatures, act strangely before the ground moved. The mythology was just their attempt to explain something they couldn't understand through available frameworks. In India, the ancient epic, the Mahabharata, describes scenes of apocalyptic animal behavior before great upheavals. Horses neighed and reared wildly. Birds flew across the sky in chaotic patterns instead of orderly formations. Snakes slithered out of their shelters and moved across open ground where they didn't belong. These weren't random details thrown into epic poetry. These were careful observations of animal behavior that somehow seem connected to major disasters. The persistence of these stories across different cultures, different time periods, and different continents is significant. If this was purely coincidence, if people were just seeing patterns that weren't there, then why does the same pattern show up in ancient Greece, Japan, India, and dozens of other civilizations? That consistency suggests something real was happening, something observable, something that repeated enough times that people recognized it as a pattern worth recording and passing down. For thousands of years, these observations accumulated. They weren't systematic. They weren't controlled. They weren't subjected to the scrutiny that modern science demands. But they were consistent. And consistency across cultures and centuries is its own kind of evidence, even if it's not the kind science traditionally accepts. The ancients understood that something was happening, even if they couldn't explain it through the lens of modern geology. They could only describe what they witnessed, and what they witnessed was animals behaving as though they knew something humans did not. Domestic animals fled their pens. Wild animals abandoned their territories. Even creatures that normally competed for resources seemed to move in the same direction, toward higher ground, toward open space, towards safety. That coordinated evacuation happened regularly enough that civilizations built it into their mythology and their understanding of natural disaster. Maybe the ancients didn't understand the mechanism, but they recognized a pattern that repeated too many times to be mere chance. The problem is that the moment science developed as a discipline, the moment people wanted actual mechanisms and reproducible evidence, animal earthquake prediction became deeply controversial. What had seemed like simple observation for thousands of years suddenly looked suspicious. It looked like superstition. It looked like the kind of thinking that preceded scientific rigor, not the kind that followed it. And in many ways, mainstream science dismissed the entire category of animal earthquake prediction as pseudoscience, unworthy of serious investigation. Geologists began pointing to something called the psychological focusing effect to explain all these historical accounts and modern reports. The basic idea is straightforward. People remember strange animal behavior specifically because an earthquake happened afterward. Their brain works backward from the event. The earthquake is the most salient thing in their memory, the most dramatic, the most important. Everything that happened before it gets reinterpreted through that lens. If nothing had happened, if the earthquake hadn't struck, then nobody would have remembered the strange animal behavior at all. It would have been forgotten like thousands of other minor oddities observed in daily life. This explanation has real psychological validity. Confirmation bias is well documented. Human memory is unreliable about sequence and causation. We are very good at finding patterns retroactively, even in completely random data. So the scientific skepticism isn't baseless. It's rooted in legitimate cognitive science, in studies of how human minds process information and construct narratives after the fact. But here's where it gets complicated. Just because confirmation bias exists doesn't mean every report is wrong. Just because people can misremember doesn't mean all the historical accounts are fabrications. The existence of a plausible bias doesn't automatically invalidate everything connected to it. And yet that's largely how mainstream seismology has treated this subject for decades. The result is that most historical accounts of animal earthquake prediction get dismissed without serious examination, without consideration of what might be real underneath the noise. The anecdotes are dismissed as unreliable. The sample sizes are deemed too small. The observation periods are considered too short. The definition of unusual behavior is too vague. All of these criticisms are technically valid, but together they create an impossible standard. If you require perfect prospective studies where animal behavior is documented before earthquakes occur, with clear definitions of what counts as unusual, measured over long periods of time under controlled conditions, then you're essentially asking for research that barely exists. Most historical accounts are retrospective, which means they're vulnerable to exactly the critiques that science raises against them. People look back after an earthquake and remember weird animal behavior, and maybe they're remembering accurately or maybe they're confabulating. There's no way to know for certain, and the few attempts to do rigorous prospective studies have been limited in scope and inconclusive in results. So the field has ended up in a strange place. Science dismisses animal earthquake prediction as unreliable superstition based on legitimate epistemological concerns. But that dismissal is so absolute that it discourages serious research into mechanisms that might actually exist. If you're a young researcher interested in animal earthquake detection, the established scientific community has made it clear that this is not a respectable research direction. You might waste years pursuing something that turns out to be noise. You might damage your academic reputation. You might be viewed as someone chasing paranormal phenomena rather than doing legitimate science. So most researchers pursuing this question seriously are in China or Japan, countries with long histories of earthquakes and cultural traditions that take animal behavior reports more seriously than the Western scientific establishment does. They have resources, they have motivation, they have fewer gatekeepers preventing them from asking uncomfortable questions. The most straightforward mechanism for how animals might sense earthquakes doesn't require anything exotic. It doesn't require new physics or unknown biological sensory systems. It's based on something simple and observable. Earthquakes produce different types of seismic waves that travel at different speeds. The fast-moving P waves arrive first, often going unnoticed by humans. The stronger, more destructive S waves arrive seconds later, and that's what people actually feel as the ground shaking beneath their feet. Most humans simply don't perceive the P wave. The motion is too subtle. The vibration is too small. Your nervous system isn't sensitive enough to detect it reliably. But many animals are different. Many animals with more keen sensory apparatus can feel those P waves. They can sense them in the seconds before the larger S waves arrive. That gives them a tiny window of warning, maybe less than 2 minutes for earthquakes that are close enough to cause damage. But 2 minutes is better than nothing. 2 minutes is enough time to be startled, to vocalize distress, to move away from dangerous structures. Animals like dogs might bark or whine. Cows might agitate and move restlessly. Birds might take sudden flight. Rodents might flee their burrows as if predators were approaching. It's all consistent with the idea that they're responding to something they perceive that you don't perceive yet. The mechanism is straightforward. The evidence is plausible. The explanation doesn't require anything unusual about animal biology. It just requires that animals have better vibration sensitivity than humans do, which is demonstrably true for many species. Many mammals have specialized sensory organs in their feet and lower legs that detect ground vibrations with extraordinary precision. These organs evolved millions of years ago to help animals avoid predators, to sense the approach of danger from a distance. That same sensory system can detect the subtle vibrations of a P wave. This alone doesn't explain all reports of earthquake prediction, especially ones that describe animals acting strangely hours or days before earthquakes occur. But it explains a significant portion of modern observations, particularly ones that happen very close in time to the seismic event. It's the baseline mechanism, the foundation upon which other theories build. It's the most conservative explanation, the simplest answer to the question of how animals might perceive something humans cannot. Different animal species have evolved profoundly different abilities to perceive their environments. Elephants can perceive low-frequency sound waves and vibrations from foreshocks that human ears simply cannot detect. Their anatomy gives them an advantage that we're only beginning to understand. Their ears, their feet, their entire skeletal structure is tuned to detecting vibrations and low-frequency sounds in ways that took evolutionary engineers millions of years to refine. Cows respond to seismic vibrations in ways that humans do not, sometimes appearing spooked or agitated before visible seismic activity. Small rodents can detect tremors or ground shifts over considerable distances. Their sensitivity shaped by evolutionary pressures in their underground habitats where early warning could mean survival. What matters is that this diversity of sensory capability means different animals might detect earthquake precursors through completely different mechanisms. Some might be sensing vibrations, others might be hearing infrasound. Still others might be responding to electromagnetic changes or chemical shifts in the air and water. The key insight is that there is no single animal sense that detects earthquakes. There are potentially multiple pathways. Dogs have thousands of times more olfactory receptors than humans, which means they might be able to detect chemical shifts in the atmosphere that precede seismic events. Whales, elephants, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, giraffes, and alligators use infrasound to communicate over distances of hundreds of miles. This fundamental diversity of sensory systems across the animal kingdom suggests that different species are naturally suited to detecting different types of pre-earthquake changes. An elephant might sense something a dog would miss. A whale might detect patterns that land mammals never encounter. A rodent's sensitivity to ground vibrations might pick up signals that birds flying overhead would completely ignore. This species-specific sensitivity would explain why earthquake prediction research is so inconsistent. You see it in some animals under some conditions, but not others. It's not that animal earthquake detection doesn't exist. It's that we're dealing with a complex ecology of different sensory systems, different thresholds, different environmental factors, all interacting in ways we don't yet fully understand. One of the most intriguing mechanisms proposed by researchers involves infrasound, which is sound below the range of human hearing. Infrasound is typically defined as frequencies below 20 Hz. Most humans cannot hear below this threshold. Our ears simply aren't constructed to detect vibrations that slow, that deep, that low in frequency. As frequency decreases below 20 Hz, hearing becomes gradually less sensitive, and you need increasingly high sound pressure to perceive anything at all. The human ear operates in a narrow bandwidth, roughly 20 Hz to 20 kHz, which seems sufficient for our needs, but leaves us blind to an enormous range of acoustic phenomena. But many animals can hear infrasound. Elephants use infrasound for long-range communication that is vital to their reproduction, their coordination of group movement, their access to resources, and their ability to avoid predators. They can detect infrasonic frequencies far below what humans can perceive, maintaining awareness of herd members across distances of many miles. An elephant can call to another elephant over the horizon using infrasound, a conversation happening at frequencies your ears cannot access. Whales, giraffes, and alligators have similar capabilities, each using infrasound for different purposes, but all demonstrating the biological feasibility of perceiving these deep frequencies. The theory is compelling because it provides a potential explanation for how animals separated by great distances might receive warning signals of an impending seismic event. As stress builds up in the Earth's crust before an earthquake, infrasonic vibrations are generated. These vibrations travel through the ground, and they can be detected by animals with the sensory apparatus to perceive them. The warning could come hours or even days before the main shock, which is far longer than the P-wave mechanism could account for. If this mechanism is real, then certain animals living in seismically active regions would have evolved heightened sensitivity to infrasound, essentially tuning their ears to listen for the acoustic signature of crustal stress, the sound of the Earth groaning under pressure. The beauty of this explanation is that it's biologically plausible. We know these animals can hear infrasound. We know infrasound is generated by seismic processes. The only question is whether the connection is real and whether it provides early enough warning to be useful. And that's the question that researchers are still trying to answer. Scientists have also proposed that rapid stresses in the Earth's crust before an earthquake cause major changes in electromagnetic fields, and that animals can sense these changes. Friedemann T. Freund, a senior research scientist at the SETI Institute, has developed this hypothesis in considerable detail. The basic mechanism involves stress in the rocks along a fault line. As tectonic plates shift and compress the rocks, they release minerals that expel ions into the air and groundwater. These ion releases change the electromagnetic environment significantly. The electromagnetic signals occur at very low frequencies, ultra-low frequency ranging down to 1 Hz or lower, and these signals exhibit a temporal pattern that seems to match the timing of abnormal animal behavior. Some researchers have found correlations between electromagnetic field anomalies and changes in how animals behave. Documentation shows that days or weeks before major earthquakes, there are changes in animal behavior within distances up to 500 kilometers from the epicenter. And at the same time, seismic electric signals, geomagnetic perturbations, and ionospheric disturbances are detected within similar distances. The signals consist of pulses, with an average frequency of about 0.01 Hz, which is extremely low frequency, waves that propagate through rock and air alike. The electromagnetic theory provides a potential explanation for why animals might sense earthquakes hours or even days before the main shock, which is far longer than the P-wave detection mechanism could account for. If anima, Owls have evolved the ability to detect electromagnetic anomalies the way they've evolved, the ability to detect other environmental threats, the way birds use magnetoreception to navigate during migration and sea turtles use it to find home beaches. Then they could potentially receive very early warning that something geological is changing beneath the surface. Birds navigate thousands of miles using Earth's magnetic field, sensing variations that would be imperceptible to human instruments without sophisticated equipment. If that kind of sensitivity exists in the animal kingdom, why couldn't sensitivity to earthquake-related electromagnetic changes also exist? Before an earthquake, the Earth's crust may release gases such as radon or carbon dioxide. The release of gases from deep within the Earth is one of the precursor phenomena that animals might be able to detect through their highly developed senses of smell. As pressure changes in the crust, pockets of positive charge move through the rocks toward the surface. This movement causes chemical changes in groundwater. Researchers have documented that the stresses along earthquake fault lines trigger these chemical reactions. These changes could alter the composition of air and water in ways that animals sensitive to such changes might perceive as warnings. Dogs have thousands of times more olfactory receptors than humans, which makes this mechanism particularly plausible for explaining why dogs sometimes exhibit unusual behavior before earthquakes that humans cannot attribute to any obvious environmental change. The dog's nose is registering something you cannot smell. It's detecting a shift in the chemical landscape that your olfactory system is simply not sensitive enough to perceive. It might be radon gas seeping from underground. It might be ozone formation from electrical activity in the upper atmosphere. It might be changes in water chemistry, perceptible only to a more sensitive nose. This mechanism also doesn't require new physics or new biology. It just requires that animals have better senses than we do, which is demonstrably true. The most famous example of animal earthquake prediction potentially saving human lives is the 1975 Haicheng earthquake in China. On February 4th, 1975, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck the city, which was home to about 1 million people. But something remarkable happened before the quake. In the weeks leading up to the main shock, despite freezing temperatures that should have kept them dormant, scores of snakes began slithering out of their hibernation dens. The reptile's unusual behavior, combined with other reports of strange animal activity, helped persuade Chinese authorities to evacuate the city just hours before the massive quake struck. The evacuation was massive. Hundreds of thousands of people were moved out of harm's way. When the earthquake hit, the destruction was severe. Entire buildings collapsed. But because the city had been evacuated, the number of casualties was kept relatively low. If the city had not been evacuated, if people had remained in buildings that would be destroyed or damaged, the number of fatalities and injuries could have exceeded 150,000. So the Haicheng evacuation potentially saved an enormous number of lives. The story became legendary in the history of earthquake prediction. It seemed to validate centuries of anecdotal reports about animals sensing earthquakes. It suggested that if we could just figure out the mechanism, if we could just learn to read animal behavior correctly, we might be able to predict earthquakes and save millions of lives. But here's where the story becomes complicated. It was later discovered that a rare series of small tremors called foreshocks had occurred before the large quake hit the city. These foreshocks were detected by seismic instruments. Chinese officials had access to modern seismology. The successful evacuation may have been due primarily to detection of these foreshocks by instruments rather than animal behavior alone. The animals might have been responding to the foreshocks, which makes sense because foreshocks would cause vibrations that animals could detect. But the human authorities were also detecting the foreshocks with their instruments. So the question becomes murky. Was it the animal behavior that saved the city, or was it the scientific instruments detecting foreshocks? The most honest answer is probably both. The animal observations certainly contributed to the overall assessment of risk, but the instrumental detection of foreshocks was also crucial. This complication is important because it prevents the Haicheng case from being the slam-dunk proof of animal earthquake prediction that it initially seemed to be. Another frequently cited modern example involves the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. This event is often presented as evidence of distinctive wildlife behavior before a major disaster. Reports from the region describe elephants moving inland, birds leaving coastal areas, and many wild animals avoiding zones where the waves later hit. The proposed explanation is that these animals detected infrasound from the undersea earthquake and the subsequent massive water displacement. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami provided some of the most compelling modern evidence. Eyewitnesses reported that about an hour before the tsunami arrived, elephants at Yala National Park in Sri Lanka ran away from a beach called Patanangala and moved toward higher ground. Flamingos breeding at the Point Calimere Wildlife Sanct. Uweri in India flew to higher ground before the waves arrived. Many other animals appeared to exhibit coordinated flight behavior away from coastal areas. The tsunami was triggered by a 9.1 magnitude earthquake, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. The death toll was catastrophic. More than 200,000 people died across the Indian Ocean region. And yet wildlife casualties in affected areas were notably small. It seemed like the animals had somehow known what was coming and had evacuated. But here again, we need to be careful about the interpretation. Scientists have not consistently recorded animals acting strangely or leaving areas days before earthquakes. What we have are mostly eyewitness accounts collected after the fact. Local people saw animals fleeing and attribute this to some kind of early sensing. It's a plausible interpretation, but it's not confirmed by controlled observation. Nevertheless, the potential explanation that these animals detected infrasound from the undersea earthquake is compelling. An undersea earthquake of that magnitude would generate enormous infrasonic vibrations that travel through both water and earth. Animals with the ability to hear infrasound could potentially detect these vibrations hours before the tsunami waves arrived. So the 2004 case is better evidence than Haicheng for a real mechanism, even though it's still based on eyewitness reports rather than controlled scientific measurement. In 2016 and 2017, researchers conducted an unprecedented study that changed how scientists approach animal earthquake detection. A team from the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior attached biologgers and GPS sensors to 6 cows, 5 sheep, and 2 dogs living on a farm in earthquake-prone northern Italy. Over several months, officials recorded more than 18,000 tremors in the region, with a magnitude 6.6 earthquake and its aftershocks occurring during the first monitoring period. This was the first rigorous attempt to scientifically test whether farm animals could detect earthquake precursors using modern technology rather than relying on anecdotal reports or the memories of eyewitnesses. The results were striking. The statistical analysis showed that animal activity significantly increased before earthquakes, with magnitude 3.8 or greater when the animals were housed together in a stable. But when the animals were out to pasture, this effect largely disappeared. The animals appeared to anticipate tremors anywhere from 1 to 20 hours before they occurred. They reacted earlier when they were closer to the epicenter, and later when they were farther away. This distance-dependent relationship was particularly significant because it matched what you would expect if animals were responding to a signal that diffuses outward from the earthquake source. The cows, sheep, and dogs increased their activity before tremors, seemingly responding partly to one another, with activity levels being 50% higher within a 45-minute window compared to previous days. This groundbreaking finding suggested that continuous monitoring of farm animal behavior through motion sensors could potentially provide early warnings for earthquakes, though the researchers emphasized that much more study would be needed before deploying such systems in different regions and with different species. The Max Planck methodology was sophisticated and addressed many criticisms of previous research. Rather than explicitly looking for abnormal behaviors in the period before earthquakes, the researchers first marked all behavioral changes that were unusual according to objective statistical criteria. This meant they weren't retroactively fitting interpretations of animal behavior to match earthquakes. They were using statistical models to identify truly unusual deviations from baseline behavior. Because every animal reacts differently in terms of size, speed, and species-specific patterns, the researchers used statistical models drawn from financial econometrics to analyze the data, the same models used to study heterogeneous investors in markets. This innovative approach addressed major criticisms of previous research, which had often been accused of retrofitting interpretations to match earthquakes rather than establishing predictive models in advance. The researchers created a system that triggers a warning signal if it registers significantly increased activity of the animals for at least 45 minutes. They used this model to predict earthquakes with magnitude above 4.0, successfully predicting 7 out of 8 strong earthquakes during their study period. In one instance, the system triggered a warning, and 3 hours later a small quake shook the region with its epicenter directly below the animal stables. The precision of this prediction was remarkable. Not just that an earthquake occurred, but that it occurred close to where the animals were being monitored, suggesting they were responding to something local rather than reacting to distant signals. This preliminary success suggests that the mechanism is real and potentially applicable in other regions with similar geological conditions and similar animal populations. The breakthrough was that they didn't just document correlation. They documented causation in a predictive sense. The model predicted earthquakes before they happened, which is fundamentally different from researchers finding patterns retrospectively. Despite these promising results, significant scientific skepticism remains about the reliability and mechanism of animal-based earthquake prediction. Wendy Bohon, a geologist at the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, is skeptical of the air ionization theory, noting that numerous geologists have unsuccessfully tried to find such a precursory signal of impending earthquakes. To use animals as prognosticators, it would be essential to establish that they exhibited unusual behavior only in reaction to upcoming seismic events, not in response to countless other environmental factors that might affect them, like weather changes, seasonal transitions, or human activities on the farm. Heiko Woith, a geologist at the GFZ German Research Center for Geosciences, praised the Max Planck study for measuring more than a single occasion of abnormal behavior, but pointed out that the timeframe was still too short to draw definitive conclusions. He notes that many studies claiming to show precursory earthquake signals rely on too little data collection over time, making it impossible to determine whether a measured signal was actually related to a quake or was simply noise in the system. The study lasted months, but how do we know that the patterns observed would repeat over decades or centuries? How do we know they would hold true in different climates, different regions, with different animal species? Furthermore, there is inconsistency in animal behavior because they do not behave differently before every earthquake. This means it's entirely possible that unusual behavior and the occurrence of an earthquake are mere coincidence, random overlap in a chaotic world. As the Chinese have discovered through their own research, not all earthquakes cause unusual animal behavior, while others do, suggesting the mechanism is more nuanced than a simple trigger system. It would also be difficult to study the behavior of animals all around the world at all times, which would be necessary to establish a reliable prediction system. The scientific community remains divided between those who believe something real is happening and those who see the research as chasing shadows, pursuing correlations that might evaporate under closer scrutiny. What we know is this: Something is happening. Animals are responding to something long before earthquakes occur. Whether that response is consistent, whether it's reliable, whether it can be trained into a prediction system that actually works, those are questions that require more research, more data, more willingness from the scientific community to take the questions seriously. We've moved from pure skepticism based on anecdotes to measurable results from controlled studies. We've documented that animals change behavior before earthquakes in ways that seem to correlate with seismic activity. What we haven't done yet is completely understand the mechanism or the reliability, and that gap between observation and understanding is where the next phase of research will happen. The Max Planck study opened doors. It showed that rigorous methodology could be applied to this question. It demonstrated that animal behavior before earthquakes is not just folklore or superstition. It's a phenomenon worth studying with the same seriousness we give to other geophysical precursors. Whether that research will lead to a functional earthquake prediction system remains to be seen. What we do know from decades of observation and modern research is that animals do strange things before earthquakes arrive. The behaviors vary wildly depending on the species, the environment, and the proximity to the epicenter. But certain patterns emerge clearly enough that scientists have started cataloging them, studying them, attempting to understand what drives these shifts. This is not systematic observation in every case, but when you compile reports from thousands of people across different continents and different centuries, you start to see consistency underneath the noise. The behaviors are specific. They are reproducible. They appear in multiple species independently, which suggests something real is happening, rather than coincidence or folklore distortion. One of the most commonly reported behaviors is escape. Animals flee enclosed spaces. Dogs bolt from homes before earthquakes hit. Livestock attempts to break free from pens and stables. Birds abandon nesting sites where they have invested considerable energy in eggs and young. This is significant because these animals are not responding to panic in the herd. In many documented cases, the escape happens while everything appears normal to human observers. There is no visible danger. There is no threat that a human watching the situation would detect. And yet, the animals move as though danger is imminent. They move with purpose and urgency. In historical accounts from Japan, Thailand and Indonesia, animals are described leaving coastal areas before tsunamis arrive. Elephants in particular are noted for this behavior. They walk inland, away from beaches and low-lying areas where the water will eventually reach. Domesticated animals like cattle and horses show similar patterns. Cows become agitated and attempt to break restraints. Horses rear and neigh constantly. These are animals that normally tolerate enclosure and captivity, yet they act as though containment has become intolerable. Dogs whimper, bark without obvious cause, and position themselves away from windows and doors. They scratch at barriers as if trying to escape invisible threat. The second category of behavior involves increased vocalization and agitation. Animals make noise that seems unrelated to anything in their immediate environment. In urban settings, dogs bark at nothing. Cats yowl and hiss without apparent triggers. In rural areas, livestock creates noise bands across entire regions. Birds take simultaneous flight in patterns that ornithologists describe as unusual, coordinated in ways that don't match normal flocking behavior. Some animals become aggressive toward humans they normally tolerate calmly. Pets show irritability and defensiveness. Wild animals become more dangerous and unpredictable. Zoo animals display behaviors documented as distress markers. These vocalizations are not casual. They are sustained and often intense. In the hours before the 2004 tsunami, witnesses described hearing elephant calls that carried unusual acoustic signatures. The animals vocalized at frequencies and intensities different from normal communication. It was as though they were expressing urgency, trying to communicate something urgent to companions. The third behavioral pattern involves sensory changes. Animals appear hypersensitive to environmental stimuli. They react to sounds that normally would not trigger responses. They become sensitive to vibrations that humans cannot feel. Rodents leave burrows where they have established safe spaces over months or years. They abandon food stores and nesting sites. They move to open ground where predators typically hunt them, which is counterintuitive because rodents are prey animals that evolve to fear open spaces. Yet they abandon this instinct before earthquakes. In caves and underground spaces, bats exhibit unusual behavior. They leave roosts that provide protection and security. Reptiles in burrows and underground habitats move toward the surface in patterns that contradict their normal thermoregulation and hiding instincts. A fourth category involves changes in eating and drinking behavior. Animals stop eating before earthquakes. This is well documented in zoo animals and in historical accounts of domestic livestock. Cows refuse feed. Dogs abandon meals. Even animals that normally eat continuously seem to lose appetite in the hours preceding seismic events. This is significant because eating is a primary driver of animal behavior. Animals prioritize food, yet this drive appears to be overridden by something stronger, something that makes feeding seem less important than whatever else the animal is sensing. Some accounts describe animals clustering together in unusual patterns. Normally, solitary creatures gather in groups. Herd animals bunch more tightly than normal. Predator and prey species position themselves as near each other, which would normally be fatal, but apparently becomes less urgent than whatever threat the animals are responding to. The consistency of these patterns across species and geography is what strikes researchers most forcefully. You see variations in specific behaviors depending on the animal type. Aquatic animals behave differently from terrestrial animals. Flying creatures show patterns that ground creatures do not. But the core behavior of escaping, vocalizing, and showing heightened sensitivity repeats across these categories. It appears in animals that have never experienced an earthquake before, which rules out pure learned behavior based on memory of past events. It appears in young animals alongside older animals, suggesting an instinctive trigger rather than experience-based response. It appears in wild animals and domesticated animals simultaneously, in areas with different climates, different geography, different human populations. This breadth of observation cannot be explained by confirmation bias alone. What makes the behavioral catalogue particularly significant is that many of these behaviors appear hours before the earthquakes occur, not seconds, but hours, sometimes more than a day in advance. This timing is critical because it rules out simple mechanisms like P-wave detection. The P waves that arrive before the stronger S waves hit seconds before ground shaking becomes obvious to humans. They provide a warning window of less than 2 minutes. But many animal behaviors appear far longer before the seismic event. This suggests a different mechanism entirely, something that allows animals to detect a signal that is not the earthquake itself, but a precursor to it. Something subtle enough that instruments designed to measure it have struggled to identify it. Something that animals can detect reliably before humans begin to feel anything at all. The challenge with cataloguing these behaviors is establishing what counts as unusual. Normal animal behavior includes vocalizations, movement changes, eating pattern variations. Animals are not static creatures. They respond to weather, to seasonal changes, to social dynamics within their groups. A single observation of a dog barking or a cow agitating might be completely ordinary. What matters is the pattern, the clustering of multiple behaviors in a short time window, the simultaneity across multiple species, the intensity that exceeds normal ranges. A dog that barks normally might vocalize a few times per hour. Before an earthquake, the same dog might bark continuously for hours. The intensity escalates. The pattern becomes unmistakable. When researchers have attempted to quantify this, they have looked for statistical deviations from baseline, not whether an animal barked, but whether the frequency of barking was significantly higher than normal, not whether an animal moved, but whether movement was substantially increased compared to typical patterns. This statistical approach removes some of the subjectivity that plagued earlier research. The Max Planck researchers used precisely this methodology. They measured baseline activity. They established what normal looked like for each animal. They then looked for periods when activity exceeded normal by a statistically significant margin. This approach eliminates many sources of bias. You are not relying on observer memory or interpretation. You have objective data, numbers, measurements, statistical significance testing. Here's what transforms animal behavior observation from anecdote into potential science. The behavioral catalogue also reveals species-specific patterns that appear to match sensory capabilities. Mammals show behavioral changes that suggest they are responding to vibrations. Birds show behaviors consistent with detecting airborne signals. Aquatic animals show avoidance of areas that would later be disrupted. Each species appears to be using its strongest senses to detect the threat. Dogs with their superior olfaction flee areas as though detecting a chemical signal. Birds with their ability to detect infrasound leave areas as though hearing a low-frequency sound. Fish in aquarium settings show agitation and unusual swimming patterns as though sensing electromagnetic changes in the water. This species-specific response pattern is the opposite of what you would expect if the behavior were random or purely psychological. It suggests that different animals are detecting different precursor signals using different sensory mechanisms. A dog's nose detects something. A bird's ears detect something else. A fish's electromagnetic sense detects something different again. All these detections point toward the same event, the same approaching earthquake. But the pathway to detection is species-specific and sensory-specific. One particularly intriguing aspect of the behavioral catalogue involves cross-species interactions. In some documented cases before earthquakes, normally predatory relationships break down. Animals that would typically avoid each other move into proximity. Birds and small mammals show reduced fear responses toward human handlers. Zoo animals that display normal aggression toward humans become calm or disconnected. It is as though all the animals in an area are responding to the same signal, and that signal overrides the normal social and survival hierarchies that would otherwise structure their behavior. This unified response suggests a powerful trigger, something that affects the entire animal kingdom in an area, not just one species or one type of sensory system. It is coordinated without apparent communication. There is no visible signal that would explain why a predator would suddenly tolerate the presence of its normal prey. No obvious reason why wild animals would abandon their normal defensive behaviors. Yet they do, which suggests the internal trigger is sufficiently powerful that it overrides millions of years of evolutionary programming. The behavioral catalogue has grown larger in the modern era because we have more observers, more documentation, more video evidence, and better communication networks. Historical accounts were preserved in writing but often lacked detail or precision about timing. Modern accounts are captured in photographs, videos, and detailed timestamp descriptions. In the 2004 tsunami, researchers were able to analyze video footage of animal behavior hours before the waves arrived. They could establish timing precisely. They could compare behavior before the event to behavior hours and days later to establish what was unusual. In the 1975 Haicheng earthquake, contemporary accounts were recorded by officials attempting to understand what had happened. The documentation was not designed to capture animal behavior, but those accounts that were recorded showed consistent patterns of snakes, rodents, livestock, and birds behaving anomalously in the days before the main shock. The proliferation of smartphones and surveillance cameras has created an unprecedented archive of potential earthquake-related animal behavior. Videos uploaded to social media platforms preserve moments that would have been lost to history in previous eras. A dog's frantic behavior minutes before an earthquake is now captured, time-stamped, and preserved digitally. This creates opportunities for retrospective analysis that was impossible before. Researchers can now examine multiple-angle video of the same event. They can study the precise timing of when each animal species begins showing distress. They can correlate the timing with instrumental seismic data with precision that earlier eras could never achieve. As we look at the behavioral catalogue in aggregate, what emerges is not random chaos, but organized response. Animals fleeing, vocalizing, changing their sensory attention, all pointing toward a coming seismic event that humans cannot yet perceive. The specificity and consistency of these behaviors across species and geography suggest this is not folklore. It is not psychological projection. It is not coincidence. It is a real phenomenon that deserves serious investigation to understand the mechanism. When you examine accounts from diverse cultures and time periods, the behavioral overlap is striking. The 2004 tsunami witnesses described behaviors almost identical to those documented in the 1975 Haicheng earthquake, separated by nearly 3 decades and thousands of miles. The animals did not read the historical accounts. They could not have coordinated their responses across continents. The similarity emerges because they are responding to the same underlying geological signals. This is what gives credibility to the behavioral catalogue. Not that individual observations are perfect or unambiguous, not that every report is accurate, but that the aggregate pattern is consistent and reproducible across independent observations. That the pattern repeats reliably enough that science can begin to investigate it seriously. The challenge in earthquake prediction is timing. Precision matters enormously. If you predict an earthquake will occur within a year, that prediction is almost certainly correct somewhere in the world, but it is useless for evacuation. If you can predict within a week, that becomes more valuable, but still inadequate for most practical purposes. If you can predict within a day or an hour, that becomes powerful. The reason timing matters is that earthquakes are rare events for any specific location. A city might experience a damaging earthquake once per century, or less frequently. If you tell people to evacuate every time an animal shows unusual behavior, false alarms become a serious problem. People stop trusting the warnings. They incur economic costs from unnecessary evacuations. Society becomes exhausted by constant alerts that do not result in earthquakes. So timing becomes critical to the utility of animal-based prediction. What the research shows is that animal behaviors appear at vastly different temporal windows before earthquakes. Some behaviors cluster in the hours immediately before the main shock. These might be explained by P-wave detection or by other very short timescale precursors. These animals are responding to something that is already happening geologically. The first waves of the earthquake have begun their journey to the surface. The animals perceive these waves and react. Other behaviors appear days or even weeks before any seismic event. In the Haicheng case, snakes emerge from hibernation roughly a week before the main shock. That is a much longer warning window. It suggests the animals are detecting something that begins days before the earthquake rupture occurs. This extended timeline P points toward precursors that develop gradually as stress builds in the Earth's crust. Foreshocks are one example. As a fault line experiences increasing stress, it often releases small earthquakes. These foreshocks can occur days or weeks before the main shock. Animals that can detect foreshocks would show behavioral changes at these earlier times. But foreshocks do not always precede earthquakes. Many earthquakes occur without documented foreshocks. Many areas experience foreshocks without subsequent large earthquakes. So foreshock detection alone cannot explain all animal behavior changes. The timing also varies with distance. Animals closer to the epicenter often show behavioral changes closer in time to the main shock. Animals farther away show changes earlier. This is consistent with the idea that animals are detecting a signal that propagates through the Earth or atmosphere from the epicenter outward. A signal that takes time to reach distant locations, but reaches nearby locations quickly. This distance dependence is exactly what the Max Planck researchers found in their study. Animals 1 kilometer from the epicenter reacted hours before the main shock. Animals 5 kilometers away reacted days before. This is not random variation. It is systematic. It is predictable. It follows the physics of how signals propagate through the Earth, which means the animals are not simply responding to chance noise. They are responding to something real that follows physical laws. The timing problem becomes complicated when you attempt to determine which animals are responding to what. Different animals might be detecting different precursor signals. A dog's sense of smell might detect gaseous precursors minutes before a main shock. A bird's hearing might detect infrasound hours before. An elephant's vibration sense might detect foreshocks days before. In a mixed population of animals, you would expect to see a cascade of behavioral changes at different time scales. The earliest warnings might come from animals sensitive to the earliest precursor signals. Later warnings might come from animals responding to later stage precursors. This temporal complexity makes it difficult to establish a single prediction timeline. But it also suggests that if you had a diverse population of monitoring animals, you might be able to detect signals at multiple timescales simultaneously. You might build redundancy into your detection system by using animals with different sensory strengths. The timing problem also relates to the absolute precision you need for earthquakes. If an animal shows unusual behavior and an earthquake occurs within 48 hours, was the behavior a reliable prediction or a coincidence? Statistical analysis becomes essential. You need to know how frequently unusual animal behavior occurs in normal circumstances. You need to compare that baseline frequency to the frequency of unusual behavior in the periods that precede earthquakes. If unusual behavior is rare and it clusters in the hours before earthquakes, that is meaningful. If unusual behavior is common and there is no statistical correlation with earthquake timing, that is not meaningful. The Max Planck research addressed this directly by establishing statistical baselines. They knew the normal activity at level of the animals on the farm. They could then identify when activity was statistically unusual. They could correlate these unusual periods to earthquake timing, and they found a statistically significant relationship. This is different from earlier research that looked at behaviors anecdotally and retrospectively. The Haicheng case demonstrates this difference perfectly. Chinese officials documented snake emergence before the earthquake. But did snakes emerge with similar frequency on other dates when no earthquake followed? Without baseline data from the same location over many years, you cannot know whether the snake emergence was unusual or routine. The Max Planck approach solved this problem by collecting months of continuous baseline data. They could then identify when the animal deviated from their typical patterns and correlate those deviations to seismic events. This methodology removes ambiguity about whether behavior was actually unusual. One crucial finding from the timing analysis is that animals do not respond consistently to every earthquake. Small earthquakes frequently produce no observable animal behavior changes. Moderate earthquakes sometimes produce changes, sometimes do not. Large earthquakes usually produce changes. but not in all animals. This inconsistency is initially frustrating for researchers looking for reliable prediction, but it is also informative. It suggests that the animal response threshold is real. Below a certain stress level or precursor signal strength, animals do not detect anything unusual and behave normally. Above that threshold, they detect and respond. This makes biological sense. Evolution would not program animals to respond to every tiny ground vibration. That would create constant foul, see alarms that waste energy and distract from normal behaviors. Evolution would program responses to precursors of genuinely damaging earthquakes, to seismic events large enough to threaten survival. The threshold effect explains why smaller earthquakes do not always produce detectable behavioral changes. The timing window for animal responses might be useful, even if it is not perfectly consistent. If animals show strong behavioral changes within 24 hours of larger earthquakes most of the time, that becomes useful information. Combined with instrumental seismic data, electromagnetic monitoring, and other geological information, animal behavior could contribute to a multi-factor early warning system. The animal response would be one signal among several. It would not replace scientific instruments, but complement them. This is the direction that modern research is moving, not attempting to replace seismology with animal behavior, but integrating animal behavior into a broader monitoring framework. The timing problem ultimately highlights a fundamental truth about earthquake prediction. Earthquakes are not predictable with current scientific knowledge. No one has successfully predicted a large earthquake before it occurred. Scientists use historical patterns and computer models to estimate the probability of earthquakes within specific time windows in specific regions. But they cannot predict when the next major earthquake will strike. Animal behavior research suggests that there may be biological signals that precede earthquakes. If those signals are real and consistent, they might be harnessed for prediction. But that remains in the future. For now, timing remains one of the central challenges in understanding how animals sense earthquakes and how that sensing might be used to warn humans of coming danger. When an earthquake strikes, the ground moves in multiple ways simultaneously. Different waves propagate from the epicenter at different speeds. The primary waves, called P waves, travel the fastest. They move through the Earth at roughly 6 kilometers per second. These waves compress and extend the rock as they pass through it, causing vertical and horizontal movement. They arrive first at any location away from the epicenter. Seconds to minutes later, depending on distance, the secondary waves arrive. These S waves move more slowly, at about 3.5 kilometers per second, but they cause much more violent ground motion. They shift the ground side to side and up and down. They are the waves that cause most of the damage in earthquakes. They are the waves that collapse buildings and detopple trees. Most human beings do not consciously feel the P wave. The motion is subtle. The acceleration is gentle relative to what the human nervous system typically detects. You might not notice the ground compress and extend slightly unless you are standing very still and paying close attention. Most people are doing something. They are moving, walking, talking, working. The P wave passes through and they remain completely unaware. But your body is experiencing the motion. Your inner ear is detecting the movement. Your proprioceptive system is registering the changes. You are just not processing them consciously. The stimulus is there. Your body senses it. But your brain does not flag it as important. The S wave is impossible to ignore. When S waves arrive, the ground lurches violently. Objects shake, buildings sway. Anything standing becomes unstable. The sensation is unmistakable. This is earthquake. This is danger. Your instinct is to move, to protect yourself, to get to safety. The moment people feel the S wave is when they begin to respond. In the seconds or minutes it takes for the S wave to arrive after the P wave, there is a window of opportunity. A brief period where the earthquake is happening, but people do not yet feel it. The seismic waves are traveling through the earth toward you. The rupture is expanding. Energy is being released. But you feel nothing because you are only sensitive to the S waves, not the P waves. If you could detect the P waves, you would have this warning window. You could begin moving to safety. You could protect yourself before the violent shaking begins. Many animals appear to have this P wave sensitivity. They can feel the compression and extension of the ground as the P waves pass through. Their nervous systems are tuned to detect these subtle motions. A dog feels the P wave and becomes distressed. A bird feels it and takes flight. A cow feels it and becomes agitated. They react to something that humans do not consciously perceive. This reaction gives them an advantage. They begin responding to the earthquake before the dangerous S waves arrive. They are already fleeing, already seeking shelter, already moving to higher ground by the time the violent shaking begins. This mechanism is straightforward. It does not require any exotic sensing ability. It just requires that animals are more sensitive to subtle vibrations than humans are. And we know this is true across many species. The reason animals might be more sensitive to P waves relates to their evolutionary history. Many animals rely on ground vibration sensing to detect predators. An elephant can feel the footsteps of other elephants from miles away through vibrations transmitted through the ground. A rodent can detect the approach of a predator by feeling ground vibrations produced by the predator's movement. These animals have evolved nervous systems tuned to pick up subtle vibrations that matter for survival. They can distinguish between different types of vibrations and respond appropriately. A strong vibration pattern might indicate an approaching predator. A different pattern might indicate a herd mate. The nervous system has the resolution to distinguish. This sensitivity, evolved for detecting approaching danger in everyday circumstances, also allows these animals to detect the subtle vibrations of P waves. The advantage provided by P wave detection is time. If you are close to the epicenter, the advantage is minimal. P waves and S waves arrive only seconds apart. But if you are farther from the epicenter, the time gap increases. At 10 kilometers from the epicenter, there might be 10 or 15 seconds between P wave arrival and S wave arrival. At 50 kilometers, the gap might be a minute or more. In an earthquake, even seconds matter. A few seconds of warning allows you to move away from windows and collapsing objects. A minute allows you to get outside or to a safer location within a building. Birds can take flight in seconds. Mammals can run toward open ground. The P-wave warning window might not save you from death in the largest earthquakes, but it can reduce injury and increase survival chances in moderate to large earthquakes. The P-wave mechanism is also observable in real time during earthquakes. When seismic instruments detect P-waves, researchers can watch animal behavior simultaneously. Early warning systems in some countries have been designed to send alerts to people the moment seismometers detect P-waves. The alerts arrive before S-waves hit, providing critical seconds of warning. Some research suggests that animal behavior follows a similar timeline. As seismic instruments detect the P-wave signal, animals simultaneously show behavioral changes. This supports the idea that animals are detecting the same signal that instruments detect, just through different mechanisms. Instruments use acceleration sensors to detect ground motion. Animals use their nervous systems, but the timing should match if both are detecting P-waves. In countries like Mexico and Japan, where earthquake early warning systems are deployed, the data shows that seismic instruments detect P-waves roughly a second or two before the more damaging S-waves arrive. During this window, automated alerts can be sent to people via phones and public address systems. It takes a few seconds for people to perceive these alerts and begin moving. By the time they are taking shelter, the S waves are often already shaking the ground. But the few seconds of head start can make the difference between being close to structural failure and being safely positioned. Animals with P-wave detection ability have an even more direct advantage because they do not rely on technology or human cognition. They respond instinctively. Their nervous system detects the P-wave and triggers movement immediately. No processing delay, no decision-making, just direct stimulus and response. The limitation of the P-wave mechanism is that it explains only very short-term warnings. The warning window is measured in seconds to minutes, not hours or days. Many reports of animal behavior before earthquakes describe changes that occur far longer before the main seismic event. These longer time windows cannot be explained by P-wave detection. They require detection of a different signal, something that develops gradually as stress builds in the Earth's crust. Something that allows animals to respond hours or days before the earthquake rupture. This is where the other proposed mechanisms become relevant. Electromagnetic field changes, infrasound generation, gas release, foreshock activity. These are precursor phenomena that develop over longer timescales. They might be detected by animals and trigger behavioral changes long before the violent shaking arrives. The P-wave mechanism remains valid for short-term warnings, but it is incomplete for explaining all documented animal behavior before earthquakes. Researchers studying this have proposed a layered detection system. Animals close to the epicenter might respond primarily to P-waves and foreshocks, providing warnings measured in minutes to hours. Animals farther away might respond to longer timescale precursor signals, providing warnings measured in hours to days. This creates a temporal signature that varies with distance from the epicenter. The Max Planck study observed exactly this pattern. The time between behavioral changes and the main earthquake varied predictably with distance from the epicenter. The closer animals were to the epicenter, the shorter the warning window. The farther they were, the longer the warning window. This distance-dependent behavior pattern is exactly what you would expect if different detection mechanisms were operating at different timescales. The P-wave and S-wave structure of earthquakes also explains why the behavioral responses of different animals sometimes differ. Animals sensitive to different frequencies might detect different wave types. Birds with acute hearing might detect infrasound generated by foreshocks or by stress changes in rock. Mammals with vibration sensitivity might detect the P-waves themselves. Fish in water might detect both acoustic waves and subtle pressure changes that propagate through water. The same earthquake produces multiple types of signals at different frequencies and intensities. Different animals with different sensory specializations detect different signals. A bird might respond to infrasonic signals hours before the main shock. A dog might respond to P-wave vibrations seconds before the main shock. Both responses are valid. Both animals are detecting real earthquake precursor signals, but they are detecting different aspects of the same geological event. This variety of sensory pathways and timescales makes animal earthquake prediction complex but also potentially valuable. Instead of relying on a single detection mechanism, you could use multiple animals with different sensory strengths to create a comprehensive early warning system. The implications of this multi-pathway detection are significant for future research. A monitoring system based purely on dogs might detect P-waves but miss longer-term precursor signals. A system based purely on birds might detect infrasound but miss ground vibrations. A comprehensive system using diverse animal species with different senso ORI strengths could potentially provide both short-term and long-term warnings. This redundancy would increase reliability. Multiple detection pathways would reduce false alarms caused by misinterpretation of a single signal. Each species would provide confirmation for the others. If dogs and elephants both show behavioral changes simultaneously, the probability that something real is happening increases dramatically compared to if only dogs showed changes. This approach would transform animal behavior monitoring from a single method system into a multi-method sensor network. The implication is significant. Within seconds of the P-wave arrival, animals detect something. Within minutes or hours, they might be detecting something else entirely. Within days, they could be responding to signals that only become apparent as stress gradually builds in the crust. This layering of detection mechanisms suggests that the physics of earthquake precursor signals is far more complex than anyone initially realized. Different signals propagate at different speeds. Different signals emerge at different timescales. Different animals are sensitive to different signals. The result is a symphony of warning signs that begins days before the main event and crescendos in the moments immediately before the violent shaking begins. The temporal layering becomes apparent when you examine the timeline of animal behavior before earthquakes. In some cases, animals show behavioral changes as much as 2 weeks before major seismic events. This extraordinarily long warning window cannot be explained by P-wave detection because P-waves only arrive seconds before the destructive shaking. The presence of multi-day and multi-week behavioral changes demands an explanation. Something must be happening in the crust progressively. Something must be sending out signals days in advance. Something must be strong enough that animals thousands of kilometers away can detect it. The challenge for researchers is identifying what that something is. Is it electromagnetic? Is it chemical? Is it multiple signals working in concert? The answer matters enormously because it determines how we might harness animal behavior for practical earthquake prediction. If the signal is electromagnetic, we would need to understand how animals sense electromagnetic fields and build monitoring systems around that capability. If the signal is chemical, we would need to identify which chemicals are released and develop sensors to detect them. If the signal is a combination of mechanisms, we would need to build redundant systems that can detect multiple pathways simultaneously. This brings us to the electromagnetic theory, one of the most intriguing and contentious proposed mechanisms for how animals might detect earthquakes long before any physical shaking occurs. The idea begins with a straightforward observation. When rocks are stressed, they change. Not just in obvious ways like cracking or shifting. They change at the atomic and molecular level. The pressure applied to rock can cause it to behave in unusual ways electrically. Crystals in rock can accumulate electrical charges as they are deformed. Ions trapped within mineral structures can be forced to move. The normal electrical balance of the rock is disrupted. These changes are subtle and usually invisible to ordinary observation, but they generate electrical and magnetic fields that radiate outward from the earthquake source. The earth beneath us becomes an electromagnetic transmitter in the days before a major rupture. Friedemann Freund at the SETI Institute has been one of the leading researchers proposing that these electromagnetic field changes could be detected by animals. His research suggests that as tectonic plates squeeze rocks along fault lines, the stress causes peroxide bonds in minerals to break down, releasing electrons and positive ions. These charged particles move through the rock, creating electrical currents. These currents generate magnetic fields. The fields propagate outward from the epicenter at the speed of light, reaching distant locations far faster than any seismic wave could travel. An animal living hundreds of kilometers from an epicenter could theoretically detect these electromagnetic changes hours or even days before the earthquake occurs. This is fundamentally different for P-wave detection, which only provides warning in the seconds or minutes immediately before the main shock. The mechanism that Freund describes is based on the physics of how rocks behave under stress. Most minerals contain defects at the atomic level. These defects are not weaknesses. They are natural imperfections that arise during crystal formation. When rocks are stressed, these defects can interact with electromagnetic fields within the rock. The stress causes movement of ions and electrons. As the stress increases, these movements become more pronounced. The electrical conductivity of the rock changes. The electrical properties at the atomic level shift. For most rocks under normal conditions, this is happening very slowly and imperceptibly. But as stress approaches the breaking point, the changes accelerate. The electrical activity increases exponentially. The currents generated by moving ions become stronger. The magnetic fields generated by those currents become measurable with sensitive instruments. What makes the electromagnetic hypothesis compelling is that it provides a plausible explanation for long-time-scale animal behavior changes. The behavioral shifts that occur hours or days before earthquakes are difficult to explain through P-wave detection alone. But electromagnetic precursor signals could start developing days before the main rupture. As stress builds gradually in the crust, electrical and magnetic changes accumulate gradually. Animals sensitive to these changes would begin showing behavioral responses well before the violent shaking begins. This explains why snakes emerge from hibernation days before earthquakes, why dogs begin showing distress before humans feel anything, why entire herds of animals become agitated days in advance of major seismic events. The electromagnetic signals that precede earthquakes are not the same frequency as the signals animals normally encounter. They exist in the ultra-low frequency and extremely low frequency ranges. ULF signals have frequencies below 1 Hz. ELF signals have frequencies up to a few hundred Hz. These frequency ranges are beyond what humans can perceive, but within ranges that many animals have demonstrated sensitivity to. Whales communicate using infrasound and very low frequency signals. Elephants detect ground vibrations at frequencies comparable to these earthquake precursor frequencies. Birds have demonstrated sensitivity to magnetic field changes. The sensory capabilities already demonstrated by these animals make electromagnetic detection plausible. Research by Freund and colleagues has documented electromagnetic anomalies in the days and weeks before major earthquakes. Using specialized equipment to measure electrical and magnetic fields in earthquake-prone regions, researchers have observed unusual fluctuations that correlate with seismic activity. The signal strength varies predictably with distance from the epicenter. Closer to the epicenter, the fields are stronger. Farther away, they are weaker. This distance-dependent pattern suggests that the signals are actually emanating from the earthquake source, rather than arising from coincidental electromagnetic noise. The timing also correlates. The strongest anomalies appear when seismic stress in the crust is expected to be highest based on other geological indicators. Days before EA, earthquakes' field strength increases. After earthquakes release the stress, field strength returns to baseline. The pattern is too consistent to be purely coincidental. Animals might detect these electromagnetic changes through several different sensory mechanisms. Some research suggests that magnetite crystals in animal brains and inner ears could be sensitive to magnetic field changes. Magnetite is ferromagnetic, meaning it aligns with external magnetic fields. Changes in the Earth's magnetic field would cause magnetite crystals to shift their alignment, potentially triggering sensory responses. Other research suggests that electromagnetic fields could interact with biological ion channels in animal nerve cells. Changes in external electromagnetic fields could influence how ions flow across cell membranes, affecting nerve signal transmission. Animals with sensitive nervous systems might detect these subtle changes in electromagnetic activity around them. Still, other research proposes that electromagnetic fields could interact with cryptochromes in animal eyes, affecting light perception and triggering behavioral responses. Magnetite has been found in animal brains in multiple species. Migratory birds possess magnetite crystals in specialized cells in their eyes and brain tissues. These magnetite crystals are aligned with the Earth's magnetic field, and they are believed to function as a biological compass that birds use for navigation during migration. If birds can sense the Earth's magnetic field well enough to use it for navigation across continents, they could presumably also sense changes to that field. Before earthquakes, if the electromagnetic precursor signals do indeed alter the local magnetic field, birds would detect those changes. The sensory resolution required is not extraordinary. Birds navigate using magnetic field directions that are far subtler than the changes proposed by the electromagnetic hypothesis. Dolphins and other marine mammals also possess magnetite-based navigation systems. Fish possess electroreceptive organs that allow them to detect electrical fields in water. All these animals have the sensory capability to detect electromagnetic precursor signals if such signals are strong enough. The strength of earthquake-generated electromagnetic signals is the critical question. Laboratory studies and theoretical models suggest that stress in rocks should generate electromagnetic signals. But do these signals propagate to the surface and to distant locations with sufficient strength for animals to detect them? The answer appears to be yes, based on instrumental measurements, but the signal strength varies with distance and earthquake magnitude. Large earthquakes near the surface generate stronger signals. Small earthquakes deep underground generate weaker signals. At great distances from the epicenter, signal strength decreases. The signal might be barely detectable at the threshold of animal sensitivity. This would explain why behavioral responses are inconsistent. Only earthquakes large enough and close enough to generate strong electromagnetic signals would trigger animal responses. Smaller earthquakes would not generate signals strong enough to exceed animal detection thresholds. The electromagnetic theory also explains why animal responses sometimes appear inconsistent. Not all earthquakes generate strong electromagnetic precursor signals. Small earthquakes might not stress the crust enough to generate detectable electromagnetic anomalies. Large earthquakes might generate strong signals. Moderate earthquakes might generate intermediate signals. Animals would only respond when the electromagnetic signal exceeds their detection threshold. This would create a pattern where only significant earthquakes trigger widespread behavioral responses, while minor seismic events go undetected by animals. This matches what researchers have observed. Animals show clear behavioral changes before magnitude 5 and larger earthquakes. They show inconsistent responses to smaller quakes. The distance dependence of electromagnetic signal propagation also explains the Max Planck observation that animals closer to the epicenter showed shorter response times, while animals farther away showed longer response times. Electromagnetic signals propagate spherically outward from the epicenter. They spread out as they travel, so signal strength decreases with distance. But importantly, the signal reaches distant locations with a time delay related to the speed of electromagnetic wave propagation through the Earth. As the signal diffuses outward, it reaches more and more distant locations. Animals far from the epicenter experience the arriving electromagnetic wave at later times than animals near the epicenter. So the earliest animal behavioral responses appear close to the epicenter, and later responses appear at greater distances. This creates the exact pattern that researchers observed. The distance dependence is so precise that it would be difficult to explain by any other mechanism. The research supporting the electromagnetic hypothesis has its limitations, however. Geophysicists like Wendy Bohon at the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology have noted that attempts to identify electromagnetic precursor signals have been inconsistent. Some studies report finding them, others do not. When signals are found, the mechanisms are often unclear. Are the signals genuinely precursory to earthquakes, or are they artifacts of the measurement process? Are they related to the earthquakes at all, or just coincidental fluctuations in the Earth's electromagnetic environment? Critics point out that the electromagnetic hypothesis requires a chain of assumptions. Rocks must generate electromagnetic signals under stress. These signals must propagate outward. Animals must have sensory organs capable of detecting the signals. The sensory detection must be wired to trigger earthquake escape behaviors. Each assumption is individually plausible, but the combined chain requires that all of them are true simultaneously. Despite the skepticism, the electromagnetic theory remains one of the more developed explanations for long timescale animal behavior changes before earthquakes. It provides a mechanism. It offers a distance-dependent prediction. It explains why timing varies with epicenter proximity. It suggests sensory mechanisms that animals could plausibly possess. It generates testable predictions. These qualities distinguish it from pure speculation. Whether the electromagnetic hypothesis is correct will require more rigorous study. Researchers would need to measure electromagnetic precursor signals with greater precision. They would need to correlate these measurements with animal behavior changes in real time. They would need to identify the specific sensory mechanisms that animals use to detect the YASI signals. All of this research is ongoing, but none of it has yet provided conclusive proof that electromagnetic detection is how animals sense earthquakes. Moving beyond electromagnetic fields, another proposed mechanism involves chemical signals that animals might detect before earthquakes. This is perhaps more intuitive than electromagnetic detection because animals clearly rely on chemical senses for survival. Dogs detect scent from miles away. Rodents navigate using smell. Fish detect chemical gradients in water. The idea that animals might smell a chemical signal preceding earthquakes is easier to conceptualize than the idea that they sense magnetic field changes. The chemical hypothesis proposes that as rocks are stressed before earthquakes, they release gases. These gases are trapped in rock under normal circumstances. But when stress increases and rock begins to fracture microscopically, the confining pressure decreases. Gases escape. They move toward the surface. They eventually reach the atmosphere or groundwater, where animals can smell them. The crushed rock that forms along earthquake faults is not chemically inert. It contains volatiles, elements and compounds that readily evaporate or dissolve in water. As pressure increases on these rocks, some of these volatiles are forced out. As pressure decreases during the stress release cycle that precedes rupture, other volatiles are released. The amount of gas released depends on the stress history and the composition of the rock. Granitic rocks containing quartz and feldspar release different gases than carbonate rocks containing limestone. Metamorphic rocks that have been exposed to high temperature and pressure regimes over geological time contain different volatiles than sedimentary rocks. The Earth's crust is geochemically diverse. Different rock types in different tectonic settings release different mixtures of gases. This chemical diversity could explain why animal responses vary by location. Animals in regions with granitic bedrock might become sensitive to specific gases released by stressed granite. Animals in regions with carbonate bedrock might become sensitive to different gases. The chemical signature of an impending earthquake could be region-specific. The specific gases released might include radon, which is naturally radioactive and emerges from underground sources. Radon emanates continuously from rock containing radium, but the rate of radon release varies with pressure. When crustal stress increases before an earthquake, pressure changes can cause radon release to accelerate. Sensitive animal noses might detect the increased radon concentration. Radon has an odor that humans with highly trained olfactory senses can sometimes detect, suggesting that less restricted animal noses might be highly sensitive to it. Dogs, which have superior olfactory capabilities compared to humans, could theoretically detect radon at concentrations far below human perception thresholds. Measurements in earthquake-prone regions have documented radon anomalies occurring days to weeks before major seismic events. These anomalies are not subtle. In some cases, radon concentrations increase by factors of 10 or more. An increase of that magnitude would be readily detectable to animals with sensitive olfactory systems. Other gases could include carbon dioxide, which is also released from underground sources and could increase as stress builds. Carbon dioxide has a distinctive chemical signature that animals might detect. Hydrogen gas might be released as water in rock reacts with minerals under stress. Hydrogen is odorless to humans, but not necessarily to animals with different olfactory receptors. Hydrogen is also flammable at high concentrations and might burn with a distinctive odor. Sulfur compounds might emerge from decomposing organic material in compressed sediments. Hydrogen sulfide and other sulfur gases have strong odors that animals could detect easily. The suite of chemical signals available for animal detection is diverse. An animal with a sensitive nose might distinguish between normal background chemical signals and the unusual chemical mixtures that precede earthquakes. A 2011 study at the Open University provided evidence supporting the chemical hypothesis. Researchers demonstrated that stress applied to rock samples in laboratory conditions caused chemical changes in groundwater. The stress caused pockets of positive charge to accumulate in rocks, disturbing the normal electrical balance. These charged particles moved through the rock and interacted with groundwater, causing chemical alterations. The research suggested that similar processes occurring in stressed crustal rocks before earthquakes could produce measurable chemical changes in groundwater and soil. Animals sensitive to these chemical changes might detect them and respond. Geochemists have documented that the composition of spring water changes before earthquakes. Measurements of dissolved gases, mineral content, and electrical conductivity of water show variations that correlate with seismic activity. The chemical changes are real and measurable. The advantage of the chemical hypothesis is that it explains animal behavior in ways that match what we know about animal sensory capabilities. Dogs have roughly 300 million olfactory receptors. Humans have about 6 million. That means dogs can smell things at concentrations roughly 50,000 times lower than humans can detect. If earthquakes release chemical signals into the air or into groundwater, dogs would detect them long before humans would smell anything unusual. The chemical signal could travel through air or water, reaching animals at great distances from the epicenter. The signal intensity would vary with distance. Closer animals would smell stronger signals and respond earlier. Farther animals would smell weaker signals and respond later. This distance-dependent response matches observations from studies like the Max Planck research. Different animal species might be sensitive to different chemicals based on their specific olfactory systems. Dogs might be particularly sensitive to certain volatile organic compounds. Rodents might detect other chemicals. Birds have relatively poor senses of smell compared to mammals, but some bird species can detect sulfur compounds and other odors. The variety of chemical sensitivities among different animal species could explain why behavioral responses appear across multiple species. Each species detects the chemical signal it is most sensitive to, but all are responding to the same underlying phenomenon: the release of gases and chemical changes preceding earthquakes. This multiplicity of detection pathways would create redundancy in the system. a monitoring network based on diverse animal species, would detect chemical signals at different sensitivity thresholds, providing multiple layers of warning. The specificity of animal responses to different chemicals also suggests that chemical detection is a viable mechanism. Experiments have shown that dogs can be trained to detect specific volatile compounds at extraordinarily low concentrations. Service dogs are trained to detect blood sugar changes in diabetic patients by smelling acetone in breath. Dogs are trained to detect cancer-related compounds in breath and body odor. Dogs are trained to detect drugs, explosives, and truffles. The chemical specificity of animal olfaction is remarkable. If animals can be trained to detect specific disease-related chemical signatures, they could conceivably detect earthquake-related chemical signatures. The question is whether the training would be necessary, or whether animals naturally respond to earthquake precursor chemicals. Some evidence suggests natural responses. Dogs and other animals have shown distress before earthquakes in regions where they have never experienced earthquakes before. They show responses without training. This suggests that the response might be instinctive rather than learned. If animals naturally respond to certain chemicals by showing escape behaviors, and if those chemicals are released before earthquakes, the mechanism would work automatically without any need for training. The challenge with the chemical hypothesis is establishing which chemicals are actually released before earthquakes, in what concentrations, and whether animals reliably detect them. Laboratory studies demonstrate that stress can cause chemical changes in rock, but the laboratory is a controlled environment. The Earth's crust is vastly more complex. Hundreds of different chemical processes are occurring simultaneously in rock. Natural gas deposits, geothermal activity, biological processes in soil, weathering reactions, and countless other phenomena generate gases and chemical signals continuously. How would an animal distinguish the chemical signals that specifically precede earthquakes from the background chemical noise generated by all the other processes? The question is not trivial. It requires that animals not only detect the chemical signals, but specifically recognize them as earthquake precursors, rather than routine environmental chemistry. Another complication is that chemical signals from underground sources must travel through rock and soil before reaching the surface where animals encounter them. This travel takes time. The signal might be delayed, attenuated, or distorted by the time it reaches animals. A strong chemical signal at the earthquake source might become undetectable by the time it reaches the surface kilometers away. This would limit the distance from which animals could detect chemical precursors. The Max Planck study found that animals responded to earthquakes up to 50 kilometers away. For chemical signals to explain this long-distance detection, the signals would need to propagate efficiently through rock and soil. Some mechanisms could allow this. Gaseous signals might travel through pore spaces in rock. Groundwater flow could transport dissolved chemicals, but the efficiency of signal propagation over great distances is uncertain. Some researchers propose that multiple mechanisms work together. Animals detect electromagnetic signals at long distances, providing warning days or hours in advance. Simultaneously, animals detect chemical signals as the main rupture approaches, providing additional confirmation. At the very last moment, animals detect P waves, the first physical manifestation of the earthquake. This layered detection system would provide warnings at multiple timescales simultaneously. The advantage of this multi-pathway approach is that it provides robust redundancy. If an animal misses the electromagnetic signal for some reason, it might still detect the chemical signal. If it misses both of those, the P-wave detection provides a last-moment warning. Different animals with different sensory capabilities would be sensitive to different pathways. Some animals optimized for electromagnetic detection would respond early, Others optimized for chemical detection would respond slightly later. Still others relying primarily on P-wave detection would respond at the last moment. In aggregate, a population of diverse animals would provide a continuous spectrum of warnings from days in advance until the moment of rupture. This multi-layered approach is more robust than relying on a single detection mechanism. Beyond electromagnetic and chemical mechanisms, other proposed pathways for earthquake detection exist, though generally with less research support. Foreshocks are a well-documented phenomenon. As stress builds before major earthquakes, the crust releases some of that stress through small earthquakes. These foreshocks can occur days or weeks before the main rupture. Animals sensitive to these foreshocks would show behavioral changes. Unlike electromagnetic signals or chemical releases, foreshocks are unambiguously real. Seismic instruments detect them routinely. The question is whether animals respond to foreshocks specifically, or whether they would show the same behavioral responses even if foreshocks did not occur. In earthquakes without documented foreshocks, do animals still show behavioral changes? If animals respond to foreshocks alone, the mechanism is straightforward. If animals respond even to earthquakes without foreshocks, other mechanisms must be involved. Some researchers have proposed that animals might detect ionospheric disturbances preceding earthquakes. The ionosphere is the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere, ionized by solar radiation. Electromagnetic signals from the earthquake source can propagate upward and influence the ionosphere. Changes in ionospheric electrical properties could generate optical effects visible to sensitive animal eyes. Some animals might be tuned to detect these optical anomalies. Research has documented that ionospheric disturbances do correlate with major earthquakes. However, the mechanism by which animals would detect ionospheric changes remains speculative. The effect would require that animals have sufficient visual sensitivity to detect subtle optical changes at very high altitudes. While some animals have excellent night vision, detecting ionospheric changes seems beyond the plausible range of animal visual capabilities. The ionospheric hypothesis faces another fundamental problem. The ionosphere is hundreds of kilometers above the Earth's surface. The optical effects of ionospheric changes would be visible to satellites and to human observers in space, but the subtlety of those optical changes at ground level is questionable. Animals on the ground would need to detect changes to the sky that are so subtle that specialized instruments have difficulty measuring them. The proposal requires accepting that animals have vision, sensitive enough to detect ionospheric disturbances that most scientific instruments miss. This seems implausible compared to the electromagnetic and chemical hypotheses, which rely on sensing mechanisms that animals demonstrably possess and use in other contexts. The ionospheric hypothesis remains speculative, pending evidence that animals can actually detect the proposed optical anomalies. Another proposed mechanism involves water table changes. As crustal stress increases, it can affect the pressure in groundwater systems. Water levels in wells are known to change before earthquakes. Animals that depend on groundwater sources might notice changes in water availability. Livestock at a watering hole might find water becoming available or unavailable suddenly. Animals might respond to these water level changes as a threat to their survival, prompting escape behaviors. The problem with this mechanism is timing. Water table changes develop more slowly than other proposed precursor signals. Most documented water table changes are observed close to epicenters, not at great distances. The timing and spatial extent of water table changes do not match the animal behavior observations, as well as electromagnetic or chemical hypotheses do. The diversity of proposed mechanisms reflects the fundamental challenge in earthquake prediction. We do not fully understand the physics of earthquake rupture. We do not know exactly what signals precede earthquakes. We do not know how far these signals propagate. We do not know which signals are truly precursory and which are coincidental. In this environment of uncertainty, multiple hypotheses exist simultaneously. Some will eventually be confirmed by research. Others will be ruled out. Probably the answer involves multiple mechanisms working in combination. Different animals detect different signals using different sensory pathways. The signals develop at different rates and propagate to different distances. The result is a complex landscape of early warning signs that begins days before earthquakes and intensifies as the rupture approaches. Understanding which mechanisms are real requires rigorous research. The Max Planck study was a step in this direction. By monitoring animals continuously over months and correlating their behavior to earthquakes with statistical rigor, the researchers established that the connection between animal behavior and earthquakes is real. Whether the behavior is caused by electromagnetic signals, chemical signals, foreshocks, P waves, or some combination remains to be determined. Future research will require more sophisticated monitoring. Scientists will need to measure electromagnetic fields, chemical compositions, foreshock activity, and animal behavior simultaneously in earthquake-prone regions. They will need to conduct this monitoring continuously for years, allowing enough earthquakes to OCC for statistical patterns to emerge. The cost is substantial. The technical challenges are significant. But the potential benefit of reliable earthquake prediction makes the research worthwhile. The research landscape is complicated by the fact that earthquake prediction has a long history of failures. Scientists have attempted to find reliable earthquake prediction methods for decades. Electromagnetic precursor signals have been proposed and largely abandoned due to inconsistent results. Chemical precursor signals have been proposed but never conclusively validated. Animal behavior has been used historically but failed to predict many earthquakes and has produced many false alarms. The accumulated skepticism from past failures makes scientists cautious about endorsing animal behavior as a reliable prediction tool. Many geophysicists consider the entire field of earthquake prediction using animal behavior to be pseudoscience, similar to astrology or other discredited predictive methods. This skepticism is partly justified. Historical claims about animal earthquake prediction have often been exaggerated or misinterpreted. The scientific burden of proof is high. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The limitations of animal behavior research are significant. Animals do not respond to every earthquake. The inconsistency means you cannot rely on animal behavior to predict all earthquakes. Any prediction system based on animal behavior would inevitably fail to detect some earthquakes and produce false alarms for non-earthquakes. How often does this happen? No one knows precisely because comprehensive animal monitoring over long time periods in multiple locations has never been conducted. The Max Planck study covered 4 months. That is far too short to establish comprehensive statistics. A meaningful animal behavior study would require years of continuous monitoring to accumulate enough earthquakes for reliable statistical analysis. The cost of such a project is prohibitive. The technical challenges are immense. As a result, the research remains incomplete. The scientific consensus reflects this uncertainty. The USGS, which oversees earthquake monitoring in the United States, makes no official endorsement of animal behavior as a prediction tool. Geological surveys in other countries similarly maintain that animal behavior is interesting but unproven. No operational earthquake early warning system incorporates animal behavior as a primary detection mechanism. Early warning systems in countries like Mexico and Japan rely instead on seismic instruments. When seismometers detect P waves, automated systems send alerts before S waves arrive. This approach is less controversial and more reliable than animal behavior-based systems. However, the lead time is short, measured in seconds, not minutes or hours. The animal behavior approach could potentially provide longer warning, but only if the mechanisms are real and animals can be monitored reliably. The research challenge is demonstrating that this is possible. Future research will likely focus on technology-enabled animal monitoring. Rather than relying on observers watching animals, researchers could deploy thousands of GPS-tagged animals with motion sensors throughout earthquake-prone regions. The animals would carry lightweight trackers measuring acceleration and position continuously. Algorithms would analyze the data in real time, looking for statistical anomalies in movement patterns. When anomalies are detected in multiple animals simultaneously, the system would flag an alert. Combined with traditional seismic monitoring, this could provide a multi-layered warning system. The animals would serve as biological sensors, detecting signals that geological instruments might miss. This approach is in early development stages. The technology, archaic in principle, but scaling it to thousands of animals in multiple regions requires funding and coordination that has not yet materialized. The practical challenges of animal-based monitoring are substantial. You would need to deploy enough animals over a wide enough area to detect precursor signals at various distances from epicenters. Small numbers of animals would miss earthquakes or produce false alarms. The animals would need to be tracked continuously for years to accumulate enough earthquakes for statistical significance. The cost of deploying and maintaining thousands of animal tracking systems is astronomical. The technical challenges of keeping the systems functioning reliably in harsh earthquake-prone terrain are substantial. The regulatory challenges of using wild animals for scientific research add additional complications. Environmental concerns about attaching devices to wild animals, or about confining domestic animals for research, create ethical questions. Despite these challenges, the potential payoff of even a modest improvement in earthquake warning time justifies continued research effort. Even an additional hour of warning before a major earthquake could save thousands of lives if evacuation procedures are in place. The question is whether animal-based detection can actually provide that advantage over current seismic instrumentation. The cost of deploying and maintaining thousands of animal tracking systems is astronomical. A single GPS collar with motion sensors costs hundreds of dollars. Manufacturing costs might eventually drop, but initial production runs are expensive. Operating costs are equally substantial. Each tagged animal must be monitored continuously, which means staff must be deployed regularly to check equipment, replace batteries, and handle medical emergencies. The technical challenges of keeping the systems functioning reliably in harsh, earthquake-prone terrain are substantial. In tropical regions, humidity corrodes electronics. In arid regions, dust infiltrates mechanisms. In mountainous areas, the topography interferes with GPS signals. In remote areas, there are no service stations where equipment can be repaired. The regulatory challenges of using wild animals for scientific research add additional complications. Many countries have strict regulations about capturing, tagging, and monitoring wild animals. Permits are required. Environmental impact assessments must be conducted. Local communities must give approval. Indigenous populations might have rights to the land where animals are being monitored. Environmental concerns about attaching devices to wild animals, or about confining domestic animals for research, create ethical questions. Does tagging an animal harm it? Do motion sensors restrict movement? Do animals reject collars instinctively? Do tagged animals survive at normal rates? Do they breed successfully? Does the presence of human researchers disturb normal animal behavior, patterns? All these questions require careful consideration. Despite these challenges, the potential payoff of even a modest improvement in earthquake warning time justifies continued research effort. Even an additional hour of warning before a major earthquake could save thousands of lives if evacuation procedures are in place. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan killed over 15,000 people in the first 90 seconds. Many of those deaths could have been prevented with just 60 seconds of additional warning time. Current earthquake early warning systems provide 5 to 30 seconds. Animal-based systems could potentially provide minutes to hours. The question is whether animal-based detection can actually provide that advantage over current seismic instrumentation and WA. Either the benefits justify the costs and ethical concerns. The practical implementation of animal-based monitoring systems would require establishing standardized protocols across multiple regions. Every earthquake-prone area has different geology, different animal populations, and different infrastructure. What works for monitoring cows on an Italian farm might not work for monitoring wild elephants across African savannas. What works for temperate regions might not work in tropical regions. Desert animals behave differently than forest animals. Mountain-dwelling species perceive environments differently than valley-dwelling species. The sensors would need to be ruggedized for different climates and terrains. Waterproof housings that protect electronics from monsoon rains might be too heavy for small animals. Lightweight designs that work for DS might break under the weight of large mammals. Temperature extremes in deserts and Arctic regions would damage batteries and electronics designed for temperate conditions. The data collection infrastructure would need to scale globally, which is an enormous logistical challenge. Instead of monitoring 13 animals at one farm, you would need to monitor hundreds or thousands of animals across dozens of countries and continents. The computational systems needed to process continuous streams of data from thousands of animals would be massive. Each animal produces gigabytes of data annually when monitoring location every few seconds and acceleration continuously. Storing data for thousands of animals over many years would require petabytes of storage. Analyzing that volume of data to correlations with earthquakes would require computational power comparable to that used by major technology companies. The bandwidth required to transmit real-time location and motion data from remote regions would strain existing communication networks. Many earthquake-prone areas lack high-speed internet connectivity. Satellite communication is available, but expensive and has limited bandwidth. Ground stations would need to be built in remote areas to relay data. The storage capacity needed to archive years of animal behavior data would require significant computational infrastructure. Researchers would need to develop standardized databases that can accommodate data from different animal species, different regions, and different monitoring technologies. A database designed for cattle might not work for tracking birds. A database optimized for Asian species might not handle African species well. Different organizations might use different tagging technologies, different data formats, and different data quality standards. Scientists from different countries would need to coordinate their research efforts, share data, and establish common methodologies. This is where the human element becomes critical. Researchers must be willing to share their data even before it has been published. Researchers must agree to use common methods even if they prefer other approaches. Researchers must coordinate timing so that monitoring efforts occur during the same time periods for valid comparisons. International agreements would be required to manage the research. Who owns the data? Who gets credit for discoveries? How are disputes resolved? Who decides which regions to monitor? How are resources allocated across regions? Funding would need to come from multiple sources. Government agencies, research institutions, and potentially private companies would all need to contribute resources. A truly global system might require billions of dollars in initial investment and tens of millions annually in operational costs. The organizational challenge of coordinating a truly global animal monitoring network is comparable to the challenge of coordinating international seismic monitoring, which took decades to accomplish and is still incomplete in many regions. Some research institutions are already moving in this direction. The Max Planck Institute continues its animal behavior monitoring research. The International Space Station now carries the Icarus system, designed to track movements of GPS-tagged animals from orbit. Researchers at UC Davis have developed miniaturized animal tags that weigh just a few grams and incorporate GPS, accelerometers, and wireless communication. Martin Wikelski at the Max Planck Institute is directing an ambitious project to launch a constellation of satellites specifically designed to track animal movements globally. These satellites would provide continuous coverage of tagged animals in earthquake-prone regions, creating a planetary network of biological sensors. The technology is advancing rapidly. Tags are becoming smaller and lighter. Battery life is improving. Data transmission is becoming more efficient. Computational methods for analyzing behavior are becoming more sophisticated. All these advances make global animal monitoring increasingly feasible. The argument for investing in animal monitoring is compelling. Current earthquake early warning systems provide at best a few seconds of advance notice before destructive waves arrive. This is enough time to trigger automated responses like stopping trains or stopping elevators, but not enough time for people to evacuate buildings. An animal-based monitoring system that could provide warning hours in advance would be transformative. People could leave buildings. Families could move to safer locations. Medical procedures could be interrupted. Industrial processes could be halted. Emergency response systems could be activated. The value of even a single hour of advance warning for a major earthquake is incalculable in terms of lives saved. The question is whether animal monitoring can deliver on that promise. But here is where the statistical challenge becomes critical. You cannot reliably forecast the future based on inconsistent historical data. If animals respond to some earthquakes but not others, then a monitoring system based on animal behavior is inherently unreliable. An early warning system that sometimes works and sometimes fails is almost worse than no warning system at all. People would lose faith in the system. They would ignore alerts. Evacuation orders based on animal behavior would be treated as false alarms. Each false alarm reduces public trust. Each false alarm triggers costs. Evacuating a city takes resources. Traffic becomes congested. Businesses lose productivity. Workers miss hours of pay. Hospitals interrupt services. Schools close. Each missed earthquake that the system fails to predict reinforces skepticism. If animals fail to respond to a major earthquake and people have been taught to trust animal behavior as a warning sign, the failure becomes tragic. Building a reliable animal-based early warning system requires understanding why animals respond to some earthquakes and not others. The Max Planck study found that animals responded to earthquakes magnitude 3.8 or greater when they were confined together, but not when they were out to pasture. This finding raises more questions than it answers. Why did confinement matter? Perhaps animals confined together behave differently than animals with freedom of movement. Perhaps the confinement creates stress that makes animals more sensitive to earthquake precursor signals. Perhaps social dynamics change when animals are in close proximity. Perhaps animals herded together can communicate threat signals to each other more effectively. Perhaps animals separated by distance cannot coordinate their responses as effectively. Perhaps the confinement physically isolates animals from certain electromagnetic signals or chemical signals that they would experience outdoors. The variables are numerous and poorly understood. Without understanding these variables, you cannot predict whether the same response patterns would appear in wild animals, or in different species, or in different confinement conditions. Magnitude threshold is also critical. Animals responded to earthquakes above magnitude 3.8 in the Max Planck study, but no earthquakes below that magnitude triggered responses. This suggests there is a threshold effect. Below a certain earthquake magnitude, precursor signals are too weak for animals to detect. Above that threshold, animals detect them, but the significance of this finding depends entirely on whether the same threshold applies everywhere. Where exactly the threshold lies depends on multiple factors. Distance from the epicenter matters enormously. An earthquake at magnitude 3.8, very close to the monitoring location, would generate stronger signals than a magnitude 5.0 earthquake hundreds of kilometers away. The same magnitude earthquake at different depths generates different precursor signals because the wave propagation patterns differ. Rock type matters. Granite and limestone generate different electromagnetic signals under stress because they have different mineral compositions. The amount of stress accumulation matters. A region with high background stress generates different precursor signals than a region with low background stress. The frequency content of the precursor signals matters. Animals sensitive to specific frequency ranges might detect some signals and miss others. An animal tuned to detect infrasound might miss electromagnetic signals in the ELF range. An animal sensitive to magnetic field changes might ignore chemical signals. Different animal species might have different magnitude thresholds. A dog might detect earthquakes that a cow would miss because dogs have superior olfaction. A bird might detect signals that a horse would not respond to because birds have magnetoreception in their eyes. An elephant might sense changes that smaller mammals cannot perceive because of their massive sensory infrastructure and complex neural processing. The African elephant has a brain that weighs 13 kilograms. It has neural structures dedicated to processing low-frequency sounds and detecting ground vibrations. It is reasonable to assume that elephants might perceive precursor signals at lower magnitudes than smaller animals. If every animal species has a different detection threshold, then interpreting animal behavior becomes extraordinarily complex. A monitoring system would need to track dozens of different animal species simultaneously, each with different sensitivities, each responding to different aspects of earthquake precursor signals. You would need dogs for olfactory detection, birds for magnetic field sensing, elephants for infrasound detection, and perhaps whales in coastal regions for detecting underwater changes. The signal processing challenge of integrating data from this many sources, each providing incomplete and partially contradictory information, would be immense. How do you combine a dog's olfactory alert with an elephant's infrasound response with a bird's magnetic anomaly detection into a single prediction model? The animals might be detecting different precursor signals. They might be responding on different timescales. They might have different false alarm rates. Creating a unified prediction system would require sophisticated data fusion algorithms that do not yet exist. Temporal variation adds another layer of complexity. The Max Planck study found that animals responded 1 to 20 hours before earthquakes, depending on distance from the epicenter. This is a 19-fold variation in lead time. For a practical early warning system, this level of variation is problematic. If an alert issued 12 hours in advance turns out to be a false alarm, people's confidence in the system erodes. If a real earthquake occurs without any alert, even though distant animals responded hours earlier, the system failed. But what about spatial variation? Did animals closer to the epicenter always respond earlier? Or did some animals closer to the epicenter respond later than animals farther away? The study noted distance-dependent responses, but distance dependence alone does not explain all the variation. There must be other factors. The orientation of the animal relative to the epicenter might matter significantly. Electromagnetic signals propagate three-dimensionally outward from the epicenter. An animal positioned at a certain angle relative to the epicenter might experience much stronger signals than an animal at the same distance, but positioned at a different angle. Seismic waves refract and reflect off boundaries within the Earth. The path that precursor signals take depends on the Earth's internal structure, which varies significantly by region and with depth. The same earthquake might generate strong precursor signals in one direction and weak signals in other directions. The time of day might affect whether animals notice precursor signals effectively. Nocturnal animals might be more alert at night and more likely to detect signals. Diurnal animals might be more alert during daylight hours. An animal might respond to precursor signals at night, but miss the same signals during the day if it is sleeping or resting. Weather conditions might mask or amplify signals in complex ways. Wind noise might interfere with animals' ability to hear infrasound. Lightning and electrical storms might generate electromagnetic noise that masks earthquake-related electromagnetic signals. Heavy rain might alter the conductivity of soil and change how electromagnetic signals propagate through the ground. Seasonal factors might change animal sensitivity substantially. Seasonal changes in temperature affect how gases dissolve in water and how volatile compounds evaporate into the air. Seasonal changes in plant growth could physically block the propagation of chemical signals. Animals' sensory sensitivity might change seasonally based on hormonal cycles and physiological state. Seasonal changes in daylight hours affect activity levels predictably. Animals might be more active and alert in longer daylight hours. Animals might be more alert in winter when food is scarcer and survival is more precarious. Animals might be more alert in spring during breeding season when territorial behavior is heightened. Animals might be more alert in summer when predation risk increases due to predator activity. Predation risk varies seasonally substantially. During seasons when predators are most active, animals might be hyper-alert and respond to subtle signals. During seasons when predation risk is low, animals might be less alert and less reactive. Food availability changes throughout the year dramatically. Hungry animals might be more focused on finding food and less able to notice environmental signals beyond feeding. Well-fed animals might be more relaxed and less reactive overall. Breeding season affects behavior profoundly in most animal species. During breeding season, animals' attention is focused on reproduction and territorial defense. Hormonal changes might increase or decrease sensitivity to environmental signals. Animals might be more aggressive and reactive during breeding season due to testosterone and other hormones. Migration patterns change throughout the year for some species. Migratory animals might have different behavioral patterns before departure than after arrival. The stress of migration might affect their sensitivity to other stimuli. The disorientation of traveling through unfamiliar territory might heighten awareness of environmental danger signals. All these biological rhythms could modulate how sensitively animals detect earthquake precursor signals in ways that complicate statistical analysis enormously. This variability makes statistical analysis extraordinarily challenging. To establish reliable correlations between animal behavior and earthquakes, you need sufficient data points. You need enough earthquakes occurring within your monitoring region to generate statistical significance. You need enough animals to distinguish signal from noise. You need long enough observation periods to capture seasonal and temporal variations. The Max Planck study covered 4 months. That is far too short to capture even one full seasonal cycle. Most earthquakes occur sporadically, randomly distributed in time. You might monitor an animal for months without any significant earthquake occurring in its region. Then several earthquakes might occur in rapid succession. The variability in earthquake frequency makes it difficult to accumulate the statistical evidence needed to build predictive models. Sample size is another constraint. The Max Planck study tracked 13 animals. 13 is an extremely small sample size for establishing statistical significance. To be confident about behavioral patterns, you would need to monitor hundreds or thousands of animals. But tracking that many animals requires proportionally more resources, more funding, more technical infrastructure. The cost scales with the number of animals being tracked. If you need to track 1,000 animals to establish reliable statistics, the cost becomes prohibitive. If you track only 13 animals, the statistics remain weak. You are caught between the need for larger sample sizes and the practical limitation of available resources. Duration is equally critical. 4 months is not sufficient to understand animal behavior in earthquake-prone regions. Consider a region that experiences a major earthquake every 10 years on average. If you monitor for 4 months, you might capture 0 major earthquakes. You might capture 1. You might capture several if you are lucky. The randomness of earthquake timing means that short monitoring periods are likely to miss most seismic activity. You need to monitor for years to accumulate enough earthquake events to generate reliable statistics. The Max Planck study is currently ongoing, with researchers continuing to monitor the same animals in the same region. But even with years of continued monitoring, the number of major earthquakes captured is likely to be small. Statistical analysis on small numbers of events produces unreliable results. Geographic variation presents yet another statistical challenge. Every earthquake-prone region has different geological characteristics. Different rock types generate different electromagnetic precursor signals. Different depths of seismic activity produce different stress profiles. Different tectonic regimes produce different types of earthquakes. An animal response pattern that works in Italy might not apply to Japan. The characteristics that make animals in California respond to earthquakes might be completely different from the characteristics that affect animals in Chile. Building a global earthquake monitoring system based on animal behavior would require establishing that the same behavioral patterns apply across diverse geological and geographical contexts. But the evidence so far suggests that animal responses are region-specific or even site-specific. The snakes that responded to the Haicheng earthquake might have been responding to factors unique to that location. The elephants that evacuated ahead of the 2004 tsunami might have been responding to signals that would not be present in other tsunami-prone regions. Without extensive replication of animal behavior studies across multiple regions, it is impossible to know whether observed patterns are universal or site-specific. Temperature and environmental conditions also confound the statistical analysis. Animals behave differently in hot weather than cold weather. Humidity affects sensory perception. Barometric pressure changes influence animal behavior independently of earthquake activity. Wind patterns affect how chemical signals propagate through the air. Cloud cover affects visibility. Seasonal changes in daylight hours affect activity levels. An animal might show increased activity on a hot day for reasons completely unrelated to earthquake precursors. An algorithm trying to predict earthquakes based on animal behavior would need to account for all these environmental variables simultaneously. The computational complexity of integrating weather data, seasonal data, temporal data, and animal behavior data into a predictive model becomes extraordinarily high. Machine learning algorithms might eventually handle this complexity, but training such algorithms requires enormous amounts of historical data covering many earthquakes under diverse environmental conditions. The inconsistency problem persists across all these statistical challenges. Not all earthquakes trigger animal responses. Not all animals respond the same way. Not all regions show consistent response patterns. Not all temporal windows show the same lead time. The question that haunts animal earthquake prediction is simple but profound. Why do some earthquakes generate detectable precursor signals while others do not? Is it because the precursor signals only exist for some earthquakes? Is it because all earthquakes generate signals, but only some earthquakes generate signals strong enough for animals to detect? Is it because animals detect all signals, but respond only when they perceive a threat? Is it because our understanding of earthquake physics is incomplete and we are missing signals? That would explain the inconsistency. The answer matters enormously because it determines whether animal behavior can ever be reliable enough for operational earthquake prediction. Some current scientific understanding does not provide clear answers to these questions. Geophysicists understand the basic mechanics of earthquake rupture at a fundamental level. They understand how stress accumulates along fault lines. They understand how that stress eventually exceeds the strength of the rock and rupture occurs. They understand the mechanics of how faults slip and how energy is released in the form of seismic waves. But the details of how stress accumulates microscopically, how precursor signals develop in the hours and days before rupture, and how those signals propagate through the Earth remain incompletely understood. Different theoretical models predict different patterns of precursor signal development. Some models based on electromagnetic theory predict field changes D, AYS, before rupture. Some models based on chemical release predict gas emanations beginning weeks before rupture. Some models based on mechanical microfracturing predict progressive changes in rock properties as rupture approaches. Different models suggest different magnitudes and distances at which detectable signals should emerge. Some models predict electromagnetic precursor signals that should be detectable hundreds of kilometers away. Others predict chemical signals with more limited propagation. Others predict signals that only appear within a few kilometers of the epicenter. The theoretical disagreement reflects genuine scientific uncertainty about earthquake physics. Scientists have not yet achieved consensus on which precursor signals are real and which are artifacts or coincidence. Different theoretical predictions lead to different expectations about what animals should be detecting and why. If the dominant precursor signal is electromagnetic, animals with magnetic sensing should respond reliably. If the dominant signal is chemical, animals with strong olfaction should respond. If the dominant signal is infrasound, large mammals with sensitive hearing should respond. The theoretical disagreement contributes significantly to uncertainty about what animals should be detecting and why animal responses vary so inconsistently across different earthquakes and different regions. What we actually know about animal earthquake detection is simultaneously less and more than public perception suggests. We know that animals have demonstrated unusual behavior before some earthquakes, documented in historical accounts spanning centuries and cultures. We know that different animal species have different sensory capabilities that could theoretically allow them to detect earthquake precursor signals. Dogs can detect odors at concentrations of parts per trillion. Elephants communicate over distances exceeding 10 kilometers using infrasound. Birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. These capabilities are real, measurable, and well established. We know that multiple mechanisms could potentially explain how animals sense earthquakes, including P-wave detection happening within seconds of rupture onset, electromagnetic field sensing happening hours or days before rupture, chemical signal detection through olfaction, and infrasound perception through specialized hearing organs. We know that at least one rigorous scientific study found statistically significant correlations between animal behavior and earthquake magnitude and timing. The Max Planck Institute research demonstrated that with proper statistical controls and continuous monitoring, animal behavioral patterns can be quantitatively linked to seismic events. We know that animal behavior changes before earthquakes at least sometimes. The question is not whether it ever happens, but how consistently and reliably it happens. What we do not know is whether these correlations are consistent enough, reliable enough, and mechanistically well understood enough to build operational earthquake prediction systems based on animal behavior. We do not know whether the distance-dependent response times found in the Max Planck study hold true in other regions with different geology, different fault orientations, and different stress regimes. We do not know whether the magnitude threshold of 3.8 applies globally, or only to the specific study site in central Italy with its particular geological characteristics. We do not know which animals are most sensitive to earthquake precursor signals in different environments. We do not know which specific precursor signals the animals are actually detecting, or whether different animals are detecting different signals. We do not know why animals fail to respond to some earthquakes that generate the same magnitude, depth, and distance parameters as earthquakes they did respond to. We do not know how to distinguish genuine earthquake-related behavioral changes from coincidental variations in a normal animal activity caused by weather, seasons, predation risk, or other factors. The scientific consensus, to the extent that one exists, is cautious optimism mixed with healthy skepticism. Animal behavior offers an intriguing research direction. The Max Planck study demonstrated that rigorous scientific methods can identify real correlations between animal behavior and earthquakes. This justifies continued research. However, substantial work remains before animal monitoring could replace or supplement existing earthquake early warning systems. The research must be expanded to other regions. Multiple animal species must be monitored simultaneously. The observation periods must be extended from months to years. The sample sizes must be increased from dozens to hundreds or thousands of animals. The data analysis methods must become more sophisticated. The underlying mechanisms must be identified and validated. All of this work will take time, funding, and coordinated effort across institutions and countries. There is no guarantee that animal behavior will ultimately prove to be a reliable earthquake prediction tool, even with all this additional research. Some researchers have proposed that even if animals cannot predict earthquakes reliably, they might still provide useful supplementary information within an integrated early warning system. Rather than relying on animals alone, a multi-layered approach could combine seismic instruments, GPS networks, strain gauges, satellite monitoring, animal behavior tracking, and atmospheric measurements into a comprehensive early warning system. Each monitoring method would provide partial information. Together, they might provide more comprehensive and earlier warning than any single method could provide. The animal component of such a system would not need to be perfect. It would only need to provide additional signal that correlates with seismic activity in a way that reduces false alarm rates and increases warning time. This is a realistic goal. It does not require that animals be perfect predictors. It only requires that animals provide additional useful information. The philosophical implication of animal earthquake research extends beyond the practical question of whether animals can be used for earthquake prediction. The research asks a deeper question about the nature of animal perception and the relationship between animals and the physical environment. Animals clearly perceive phenomena that humans cannot. Dogs smell odors at concentrations far below human detection thresholds. Bats hear ultrasonic frequencies beyond human hearing. Migratory birds sense magnetic fields. Elephants communicate using infrasound. The natural world is full of signals that most humans never perceive directly. The idea that animals might detect earthquake precursor signals is simply recognizing that the perceptual world inhabited by animals includes dimensions that humans typically ignore. This recognition has practical implications beyond earthquakes. If animals can reliably detect earthquake precursor signals, They might also detect other environmental changes that precede natural disasters. Animals might sense the pressure and temperature changes that precede volcanic eruptions. Animals might detect the atmospheric changes associated with severe storms. Animals might perceive the early stages of disease outbreaks through subtle chemical signals. The broader research direction is toward using animals as biological sensors for environmental phenomena. Rather than dismissing unusual animal behavior as coincidence or superstition, modern science should investigate whether animals are detecting real phenomena that our instruments are missing, or that our instruments detect only later than animals detect them. This is not a return to superstition. It is a recognition that evolution has equipped animals with sensory capabilities refined over millions of years. Those capabilities exist for reasons. Understanding what animals perceive enriches our understanding of the world. The future of earthquake early warning almost certainly does not depend on animal behavior alone. Seismic instruments will continue to be the primary source of earthquake detection and early warning because they are reliable, well understood, and scientifically validated. But the future might include animals as supplementary sensors added to existing networks. The practical question is whether the added complexity, cost, and uncertainty of integrating animal monitoring into early warning systems is justified by the potential benefit of even a few additional minutes of warning time. For regions with high seismic risk and dense populations, additional warning time could save thousands of lives during a single major earthquake. The answer might be yes, making the investment worthwhile despite the challenges. For regions with lower seismic risk or smaller populations, the cost of animal monitoring might not be justified by the potential benefit relative to other safety investments. The answer might be no. Different regions might reach different conclusions based on their specific circumstances, geography, population density, and available funding. What seems certain is that animal behavior before earthquakes will remain a subject of scientific investigation for the foreseeable future. The mysteries have not been solved. The mechanisms remain unclear. But the research continues, driven by curiosity and the hope that understanding could eventually save lives. Every new study adds pieces to the puzzle. Every careful measurement brings us closer to understanding whether animals truly possess an ability to sense earthquakes before humans can perceive them, and whether we can harness that ability to provide advance warning when the earth inevitably shakes. The stakes are high because the consequences of successful earthquake prediction could be transformative for civilization. The stakes are also high because failed promises and false hopes in earthquake prediction could erode public trust and misdirect resources from approaches that are more immediately practical. The research must continue carefully, skeptically, and scientifically, always asking whether the evidence truly supports the claims, whether the mechanisms are plausible, and whether the practical benefits justify the costs. That balance between optimism and skepticism is what separates good science from wishful thinking.